Paris smelled of burnt sugar and scorched meat. March 18th, AD 1314. On a small island in the Seine, Jacques de Molay, the final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, cooked over a slow fire. He shouted curses at the king and the pope through the smoke. He swore both men would stand before God within the year. A martyr's death, a spectacle, and from one angle, a total business collapse. De Molay died for a belief. He believed his order could not be touched. He believed God guarded its gold. He believed a holy mission shielded him from a broke king's accountants. He was wrong. Far to the north, in the frozen swamps of the Baltic, another brotherhood in white cloaks watched the smoke drift across Europe. They drew a different conclusion. Ideas do not turn back cavalry. Prayers do not fund garrisons. But land. Land does not vanish. They chose land. The story of the Teutonic Knights does not open in a sun-baked desert with a vision from heaven. It opens in AD 1190, in the mud and stink of a crusader camp outside the walls of Acre. No angels sang. No light split the sky. There were only flies on the dying, dysentery in the trenches, and the smell of rotting bandages. The Third Crusade was a logistical disaster. The German-speaking troops suffered worst, ignored by the French and English commanders. So a handful of merchants from Lübeck and Bremen did what merchants do. They did not beg for a miracle. They fixed the problem. They pulled a sail off one of their cargo ships, tied it between wooden poles, and opened a field hospital under the canvas. Their first task was not killing for Christ. It was emptying bedpans and stitching shut sword wounds. That was the order's blood from the first day. Not holy fire, spreadsheets, logistics, patient counts. They were not founded as warriors. They were founded as managers. This is not the legend they sold you. This is not knights in shining armor on a noble quest. This is the story of the most ruthless corporation of the Middle Ages. White-cloaked operators who swapped the cross for a property contract. Men who built a state of brick, iron, and silence on the bones of tribes nobody remembers. They outlasted the Templars because they grasped one rule de Molay forgot. Survival is the only virtue worth keeping. They did not earn the romantic legend. They took the future. Before we step into their world of blood and ledgers, tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Take a second to subscribe and back this project. We dig deeper than anyone else. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. For the first 30 years after Acre, the Teutonic Order was nothing. A footnote, the third son in a family of military orders, eating scraps in the shadow of the rich Templars and the respected Hospitallers. Poor, obscure, stationed in a dying business called the Crusader States. Their first house in the Holy Land was a converted hospital near the Tower of Flies in Acre Harbor, where the sea wind never quite covered the smell of the wards. Their first Grand Master, Heinrich Walpott, ran it like an infirmary first and an army second. When he died around AD 1200, the order owned almost nothing outside the walls of that one city. A second Grand Master came and went. A third. None of them mattered. Then, in AD 1209, they picked a new Grand Master. His name was Hermann von Salza. He was a minor Thuringian noble, the son of a ministerial family who had served the landgraves of Thuringia for generations. He was not a war hero. He was not a saint. He was something rarer and more dangerous. A political mind that read Europe the way a chess master reads a board, 5 moves ahead of every king and cardinal in the room. He looked at his struggling little order and did not see a charity. He saw an undervalued asset. 2 men ruled Christendom on paper. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, and the reigning Pope in Rome. The two men despised each other. Their feud was a slow earthquake threatening to crack the continent in half. A normal cleric would have ducked his head and waited for the storm to pass. Hermann von Salza walked straight into the gap between them and set up shop. Frederick II was something out of a fever dream. They called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Born in a market square in Jesi in December 1194, delivered in a public tent his mother Constance had ordered raised, so that no one could later question his legitimacy. Raised in Sicily, fluent in 6 languages, including Arabic. He kept lions and leopards in his palace at Palermo. He kept a giraffe sent to him by the Sultan of Egypt. He wrote a textbook on falconry called De Arte Venandi cum Avibus that scholars still cite today. He surrounded himself with Jewish astronomers, Muslim bodyguards, and Greek translators. He held court in 3 languages at once. Pope Honorius III excommunicated him. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him again. Pope Innocent IV deposed him at the Council of Lyon in AD 1245. Rome called him the Beast from the Apocalypse. They put his face on pamphlets with 7 heads. He laughed and kept reading Aristotle. 2 grinding plates. Hermann set his order directly on the fault line. He met Frederick for the first time around AD 1216, when the future emperor was still a young king of Sicily fighting for his crown. Whatever passed between them in that meeting stuck. For the next quarter century, Frederick treated Hermann as one of the few men on the planet he actually trusted. He gave him a personal seat at his court. He let him sleep in the royal apartments at Foggia. He sent him on missions no one else could be trusted with. To Frederick, Hermann was the worldly diplomat, the only churchman who spoke the language of real power. To the Pope, he was the cool hand on the emperor's shoulder, the one man who could whisper sense into the heretic. He rode from imperial court to papal palace and back, carrying sealed letters, brokering ceasefires, smoothing tempers. The chronicles record him crossing the Alps in winter more than a dozen times. His knees were said to be ruined by AD 1230 from the constant riding. Every favor he traded came with a price tag. A papal bull here, an imperial charter there, a tax exemption, a grant of privilege, a piece of land. Pope Honorius III alone issued more than 100 privileges to the Teutonic Order during Hermann's tenure. Frederick gave him estates in Sicily, in Apulia, in the Brenner Pass, in Thuringia, in Franconia. Every grant was small. Together, they began to look like a country scattered across Europe. He was not collecting souls. He was building a portfolio. A decade of this. Letters, bribes, midnight meetings, careful smiles. There is a scene preserved in the chronicle of Richard of San Germano, AD 1225. Frederick was about to marry Yolande of Jerusalem, the heiress to the Crusader throne, in the Cathedral of Brindisi. Hermann von Salza was the man who negotiated the marriage contract. He stood beside Frederick at the altar. The next morning, while Frederick was already taking Yolande's cousin to bed, it was Hermann who explained the situation to the bride's furious father. He soothed the scandal. He kept the alliance. He walked out of that room with another charter in his sleeve. That was the groundwork. The masterstroke came from somewhere nobody was watching. It came from a swamp. Conrad of Masovia was a Polish duke with a problem he could not solve. His capital at Plock sat on the Vistula, a day's ride from the Prussian frontier. For years, the pagan tribes across that border, the Pomeranians, the Podgesanians, the Sambians, the Natangians, had been pouring south into his lands, burning his villages, dragging his peasants north in chains to be sold or sacrificed in oak groves to a god the chronicles call Perkonaz, the thunder god whose priests kept a fire burning day and night at the holy site of Remuva. Conrad had sent his own knights against them. They had been butchered in the marshes around the Drowica River. He had hired a smaller crusading order founded by Bishop Christian of Oliva, the Knights of Dobrzin, 15 knights in red mantles with a star and sword. The Prussians had wiped them out inside 2 years. Now, Conrad was desperate. In AD 1226, he offered the Teutonic Knights a strip of land along his frontier called Chelmno, Kulmerland, in German. The deal was simple: be my border guards, kill the Prussians, keep the strip. Hermann von Salza listened. He smiled. He saw exactly what Conrad was offering: a mercenary contract with no future, a slow death in someone else's swamp. But he saw something else too. He saw a country with no king, no bishops with deep roots, no tangled web of dukes and counts to argue over every acre. A blank page, the kind of place where a clever man with the right paperwork could build whatever he wanted. He accepted Conrad's offer in public, with embraces and signatures. Then he rode south to find his friend Frederick, who was wintering in the Italian town of Rimini on the Adriatic coast, planning his long-delayed crusade. March, AD 1226. The audience hall at Rimini smelled of wax and damp wool. Frederick was 31 years old. Hermann was past 50. The emperor put his seal to a document that almost nobody noticed at the time. History calls it the Golden Bull of Rimini. It is one of the most audacious legal instruments ever written in the Middle Ages. The bull granted Hermann von Salza and every Grand Master after him the lands offered by Conrad. That was the small print. The large print granted them every additional acre they might ever conquer from the Prussians, with full sovereign rights: the right to mint coins, the right to hold markets, the right to collect taxes, the right to judge capital cases, not as a vassal of Poland, not under any bishop, not answerable to the duke who had invited them in. They would hold this future country as princes of the Holy Roman Empire, answering only to the emperor far to the south and the pope far to the west. 2 men who would never come north to check on them. Read that again. Before a single Teutonic boot had crossed the Vistula, before a single Prussian had been killed, Hermann von Salza already held the deed to a country that did not yet exist. Conrad of Masovia thought he had hired bouncers. He had handed the keys of his own duchy to the men who would one day rule over his great-grandchildren. He would not understand the trick for 30 years. By then, it would not matter. His own son, Casimir, would die fighting the men his father had invited in. With the law in their saddlebags, the knights began the real work. The first commander on the ground was a Westphalian named Hermann Balk, named Landmeister of Prussia in AD 1230. He crossed the Vistula in the spring of AD 1231 with 7 knights and a few hundred sergeants. 7 men. That was the founding garrison of what would become the Teutonic state. What followed was not a crusade, it was a machine, a self-feeding loop of conquest, settlement, and revenue that the order would refine over the next half-century into something close to a perfect colonial algorithm. Phase 1. A small column of knights and their native auxiliaries, the Turcopoles in the south, the Prussian converts in the north, would cross the Vistula in spring. They would ride hard until they found high ground, a bluff over a river, a hill at a crossing. Balk's first sight was an oak tree above the Vistula. He had his men cut down everything but that one tree and build a watchtower into its trunk. They called the place Thorn. Today, it is Torun, the city where Copernicus would be born 3 centuries later. From this fort, they burned the surrounding villages, scattered the local clan, and killed every warrior they could catch. Phase 2. Once the immediate area was beaten down, the masons came up the river behind the soldiers. They tore the wooden walls apart and replaced them with brick. They burned clay from the riverbanks in long kilns until the air shimmered with heat. The order imported the kiln masters from Lombardy. They imported the architects from the Rhineland. Then they raised an Ordensburg, a castle of the order. These castles were nothing like the slender stone keeps of France. They were red brick fortresses on a standard square plan. 4 high walls, a central courtyard, a chapel along one side, a dormitory, a refectory, a kitchen, granaries lining the others. No decoration, no mercy. The chapter house at the center where the brothers met to vote on every major decision. A handful of knights could hold one against 1,000 attackers. Fire could not touch them. Time could not soften them. They were a sentence written in brick across the Prussian forest. We are here. We are staying. There is nothing you can do. Phase 3. Recruiters fanned out across Germany. They walked into villages where peasants worked from dawn to dark on land they would never own, paying half their grain to a count who had never spoken to them. The recruiters offered something those peasants had never heard before: land. Their own land. Freedom from the old feudal chains. A new town with German law and a German council, built around a new church, near a new castle. The legal instrument was called the Kulm Law, issued in AD 1233. It became the template for hundreds of new towns, 2 hides of land per family, 6 years free of tax, the right to inherit, the right to leave. Compared to what they had at home, it was paradise on parchment. They came in thousands. Farmers from Swabia, smiths from Westphalia, tanners from Saxony, brewers from Franconia, weavers from Flanders, Dutch dike builders to drain the marshes. They cleared the dark Prussian forests with axes and oxen. They drained the swamps around the lower Vistula. They built straight roads and square fields where there had been wolves and aurochs a year before. The order issued the charters and set the tax rates. The order controlled the trade in grain and the trade in amber, which washed up on the Baltic coast like yellow gold after the storms of October. The order's mills ground every loaf. The order's ports loaded every ship. The profits funded more knights. More knights took more land. More land brought more colonists. More colonists generated more taxes. The wave rolled east. By AD 1240, the order held the lower Vistula. By AD 1250, they had reached the Pregel. By AD 1255, on a hill above the Pregel mouth, they founded a new fortress and named it after the King of Bohemia, who was riding north on crusade with them. Königsberg, the King's Mountain. Today, the Russian city of Kaliningrad sits on the same ground. Conquer, build, colonize, tax, repeat. Compare this to what the Crusaders were doing in the Holy Land. The great castles of Outremer, Crac des Chevaliers, Margat, Belvoir were engineering miracles, but they were islands. A few thousand Franks ruling over hundreds of thousands of Arabs and Syrians who spoke a different language, prayed to a different god, and counted the days until the foreigners would leave. Cut the supply line to the coast, and the whole thing collapsed within a generation. Acre itself would fall in AD 1291. The Teutonic Knights would be evicted from the Holy Land by Mamluk cavalry 40 years before they finished conquering Prussia. They watched that failure from a distance and drew a different conclusion. They were not going to occupy a hostile population. They were going to replace one. They did not want to rule the Prussians. They wanted the Prussians to not exist. They brought their own farmers, their own priests, their own language and law and bread. They poured German Europe over the bones of pagan Europe and waited for the new layer to harden. The Prussians did not lie down for any of this. For more than 50 years they fought back, with the cold rage of people who knew they were watching the end of their world. Their story has almost vanished, because their culture lived in spoken word and song, and the men with the brick castles and the chronicles wrote the only version that survived. The main written account of their struggle comes from a Teutonic propagandist named Peter of Duisburg, whose Chronica Terrae Prussia was completed around AD 1326. Even through his hostile pen, the truth seeps out. The Prussians could not meet heavy cavalry on open ground, so they used the land they had been born to. The black forests where a man could disappear in 3 steps. The deep swamps where a horse would sink to its belly. They learned to wait for the spring thaw when the knights could not ride. They ambushed supply trains. They cut down isolated patrols. They appeared at dawn and were gone by noon. They besieged the new castles and killed every German settler they could find outside the walls. A first uprising broke out in AD 1242, led by Duke Swiedepelk of Pomerelia, who had decided the order was a worse neighbor than the pagans. The order survived by the thinnest margin. Then, in September AD 1260, news came from far to the north that an army of Lithuanians had destroyed a Teutonic and Livonian force at the Battle of Derby on the Latvian coast. 150 knights died in a single afternoon, including the Livonian Landmeister Burkhard von Hornhausen. When word reached the Prussian tribes, they rose up across every conquered territory at once. The Great Prussian Uprising. Each tribe chose its own war leader. Henrik Monte for the Natangians, Glapa for the Warmians, Diwanus for the Bartians, Oktum for the Sambians. The chronicle preserves their names because the war was so long the order had to learn them. It nearly drove the order back into the sea. The castles of Bartenstein, Wiesenburg, and Heilsberg fell. Hundreds of German settlers were killed in their villages. The Bishop of Sambia was hunted down and burned. It lasted 14 years. It was a war without quarter on either side. The order's answer was a strategy with a cold name: the Reisen, the riding. They waited for deep winter, when the temperature dropped below freezing for weeks, and the frozen rivers and marshes turned the impassable wilderness into open ground for heavy cavalry. They sent word to every court in Germany: come north, earn salvation, hunt pagans. Young noblemen from Brandenburg, Austria, England, France, even Castile, rode to Prussia for a season of holy slaughter, the way later gentlemen would book a tiger hunt. The order called it the honor table. The visiting lords ate at it after a successful raid. Peter of Duisburg writes about these campaigns with something close to pride. The knights did not march to defeat a tribe's warriors. They marched to remove the tribe. They burned every village in their path. They killed the livestock. They torched the grain stores. They destroyed seed for next year's planting. The goal was a famine with a date stamped on it. Submit by spring or starve by autumn. Prisoners were not the point. Duisburg describes knights cornering whole communities in their wooden hill forts and setting the timbers on fire, then sitting on horseback outside the walls and listening to the screams. He describes the chieftain Henrik Monte being captured at last in AD 1273, hanged from a tree, and run through with a sword while he still kicked. He describes Diwanus killed by a crossbow bolt during the siege of Schonsay. He describes a captured Prussian noble named Oktum placed inside his own armor and roasted slowly over coals until the metal glowed and the man inside stopped screaming. He writes these passages without flinching. He writes them as success reports. The white cloak with the black cross, was not a sign of salvation in those forests. It was the brand burned onto the skin of a dying people. By AD 1283, it ended. 2 generations of slaughter. The Prussian resistance was a memory. Their warriors were dead. Their sacred oak groves at Romuva were chopped down and burned, the smoke of their gods drifting across newly plowed German fields. Their high priests, the Crywin, had been hanged or executed in their armor over fires. The survivors were enslaved on the land their grandfathers had walked free. Over the next 100 years, their language would fade out of the villages. Their songs would stop being sung. Their names would be replaced. The last native Prussian speaker would die around AD 1700. They would become German, or they would become nothing. The conquest was finished. The startup years were over. Hermann von Salza had died decades earlier, in March AD 1239, at Salerno. In the same week, his friend Frederick was excommunicated for the second time. He never saw Prussia with his own eyes. He never set foot in any of the castles his order would build there. But his vision now stood on the map. Not a holy relic in a distant desert. A solid, sovereign, profitable state on the Baltic coast, paying its taxes in grain and amber, defended by red brick fortresses, run by men in white cloaks who answered to nobody on this continent. We have just walked through the bloody foundation of the Teutonic state. It was not built on faith. It was built on contract law, on city charters, on grain prices, on winter cavalry tactics, on 100 small decisions made in candlelit rooms by men who understood logistics. Pulling apart these hidden structures is what we do here at Ancestral. It is what separates this channel from every surface-level history feed out there. If that is the kind of work you want more of, if you need to know the how behind the what, then your place is inside our inner circle. The lineage. Joining is not just clicking a button. You become part of the team that keeps these deep investigations alive. You make sure these stories get told the way they deserve to be told. You get early access to our work, and you join the people who understand that history is decided in backrooms and ledgers, not just on battlefields. Click the Join button below. Step into the lineage. The machine was perfected. The land was secure. The grain ships were leaving port every spring loaded to the waterline, sailing for Lubeck and Bruges and London. Every corporation that hits the top of its market faces the same temptation. Build the monument. Raise a headquarters so massive that its shadow becomes a statement of permanent rule. The Grand Master was already drawing the plans. A new capital, not a converted hospital, not a wooden tower. A new site on a low bluff above the river Nogat, in a place the order would call Marienburg, the fortress of St. Mary. Construction began around AD 1274, while the smoke from the Prussian villages was still in the air. The walls would rise 3 stories high in fired brick. The complex would cover 21 hectares before they were done. There, they were about to begin laying the stones of what would become the largest castle ever built by human hands on this earth. But the men who had stood at the top of the world before them, the Templars, had also built monuments. Glittering preceptories from Paris to Jerusalem, towers full of gold in every capital, a war chest the kings of Europe envied, and on a small island in the Seine, none of those monuments had saved Jacques de Molay from the fire. Inside the new walls of Marienburg, a question was already taking shape, a question nobody dared ask out loud. If they built the throne, who would come to sit on it? And what would he do when the kings of Europe finally noticed that a private brotherhood of merchant knights had quietly built a sovereign country on the edge of their continent? The year AD 1309 was the hinge. Acre had fallen to the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil in May of AD 1291. The siege had lasted 43 days. The Templars made their last stand in their fortified compound on the southwestern point of the city, where the chronicler known as the Templar of Tyre, an eyewitness who escaped on one of the last ships, watched the great hall collapse on top of the defenders when the Mamluks tunneled beneath it. The walls were torn down stone by stone afterward. The harbor was filled in with rubble, so no Christian ship would ever land there again. Olive groves were planted over the rubble. The Crusader project in the east was a corpse. For the Templars, that corpse was their own death warrant. No holy war meant no purpose. No purpose meant no excuse for the vaults of gold beneath their Paris preceptory. Philip IV of France did the math in AD 1307. He owed the order 500,000 livres. He could not pay it. The arrests came at dawn on Friday, the 13th of October. 15,000 Templars were taken in a single coordinated raid across France. The torture rooms followed, confessions written by clerks in candlelight. 7 years later, on March 18th of AD 1314, Jacques de Molay burned on the Île aux Juifs alongside Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy. Both men retracted their confessions in their last hour. Both shouted the famous curse from the flames. The Teutonic Knights watched all of this from the north. They did not have the same problem. Their holy war was alive and turning a profit every spring. That year, Grand Master Siegfried von Feuchtwangen made the decision that finished their transformation from a brotherhood of monks into a sovereign government. He packed up the order's headquarters in Venice, where the Grand Master had been living in a leased palazzo near the Church of Santa Trinita as a guest of the Doge Pietro Gradenigo, and he sailed north. The seat of the order moved to Marienburg, in the middle of the conquered Prussian heartland. It was not a relocation. It was a declaration. He arrived by river barge in September of AD 1309. The order's chronicle records that the brothers came out to meet him singing the Te Deum. Siegfried died 18 months later, before the new capital had even been finished. He was buried in the chapel of St. Anne in the High Castle, where the tombs of Grand Masters would line the walls for the next century and a half. Marienburg was not built as a castle. It was built as a capital. The site sat on a low bluff above the river Nogat, 20 miles south of where the Vistula empties into the Baltic. Construction had begun in the AD 1270s on a modest convent fortress. Once the Grand Master arrived, the project exploded outward. Over the next century, 3 connected complexes rose on the riverbank. The High Castle, where the brothers slept and prayed. The Middle Castle, where the Grand Master held court, and the guests were housed. The Outer Bailey, where the workshops, stables, and granaries ran day and night. Walls within walls, gates within gates. Drawbridges over flooded moats fed from the Nogat. By the time it was finished, the outer perimeter ran nearly 2 miles. The fired brick consumed entire forests of timber for the kilns at Stum and Meuwe. Local annals record clay barges arriving on the Nogat at a rate of 3 per day during peak construction. The architect of the Middle Castle's main hall was a master mason named Nikolaus Fellenstein, brought up from Cologne, who signed his work with a small chisel mark of a bishop's mitre in the corner of the central column. The garrison inside was 3,000 men. But the military function was almost a side note. The real work happened in the chancery. Marienburg was the head office of the most efficient operation in Northern Europe. Inside its walls sat a city of clerks, scribes copying out land contracts in fast Gothic script on parchment imported from Bohemia, treasurers counting silver coin into oak chests bound with iron straps, marked with the seal of the treasurer of the order. an office held in AD 1410 by a brother named Thomas von Merheim. Quartermasters logging barrels of salted pork, sacks of flour, bales of linen, kegs of Rhenish wine. Diplomats writing letters in Latin to Avignon, in Italian to Florence, in French to London, in German to Lübeck. The order ran a centralized state from those rooms, tax assessments from Königsberg, amber prices from Danzig, toll receipts from the bridges over the Vistula, grain export quotas from Elbing, court verdicts from the smaller commanderies at Christburg, Schwetz, and Brandenburg. Every transaction in Prussia flowed up the chain to a single accounting house inside Marienburg, where it was entered into ledgers and reported to the Grand Master at his weekly council. The order's account books, the Grosses Ämterbuch and the Marienburger Tresslerbuch, survive in fragments to this day. They record everything from the price of a candle to the cost of a war horse from Pomerania. The building itself bragged. The Grand Master's chambers had hypocaust heating. Hot air pushed through clay channels under the flagstones from a furnace in the cellar called the Heizkammer. The system was based on Roman designs the order had studied in Italy. On winter mornings, the stone floor was warm to bare feet. The latrine towers, called danskers, extended out from the walls on stone bridges and dropped waste straight into the river below, while clean spring water ran through ceramic pipes to flush them. Stagnant air was vented through chimneys to a height where the smell died before it reached the courtyards. The Grand Refectory could seat 400 guests under a single vaulted ceiling held up by 3 slender granite columns, called the palm columns, because the vault ribs fanned out like fronds from their capitals. Stained glass cast colored light across long oak tables. The walls were painted with scenes from the Apocalypse and the lives of the warrior saints, Saint Maurice, Saint George, Saint Sebastian. Visiting envoys from Paris and Rome wrote home stunned. A French herald named Gilibert de Lannoy passed through in AD 1413 and said he had seen no king's palace in Christendom that matched it. The Burgundian knight Gilibert de Lannoy listed it among the wonders of the north, alongside the bells of Novgorod and the harbor of Constantinople. Marienburg was a machine designed to break the will of anyone who walked through its gates. The message was a single sentence repeated in every brick. We are the state. With the headquarters fixed, the order refined its most lucrative product, the ricin, the seasonal raids against the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the last pagan kingdom on the European continent. By the 14th century, the religious paint had worn thin. The ricin had become something stranger and more modern, the world's first organized war tourism industry. The order's propaganda department, run out of the chancery by clerks like the chronicler Weigand of Marburg, produced glossy invitations. They were sent to every royal court in Europe, to Paris, to London, to Prague, to Vienna, to Avignon, to Lisbon. Come north. Earn your crusading vow. Hunt the last pagans in Christendom. Eat at the honor table. Bring home a story for the rest of your life. The English crown chronicler Thomas Walsingham noted that for a young nobleman of the late 14th century, a season in Prussia was as expected as a tournament at Smithfield. The pitch worked. Bored young nobles with no real wars to fight came in droves. Jean Le Mangre, the future Marshal Boucicaut of France, came twice, in AD 1384 and AD 1390. Henry of Derby, the future King Henry IV of England, came in AD 1390 and again in AD 1392. He brought 300 men, a personal chaplain, a tailor, a cook, a minstrel, and his own physician, Master Paul. The household accounts of his trip survive in the public record office at Kew, and they read like a luxury travel itinerary. Furs from Danzig. A new set of plate armor commissioned in Königsberg. Falcons. Silk for banners. A pet bear cub bought for 20 shillings and shipped back to England in a wooden cage. 6 pounds of sugar to sweeten the wine. A new saddle inlaid with silver. The guests arrived at Marienburg to receptions that no court at home could match. They were housed in the comfortable chambers of the middle castle. They were feasted on roast crane, boar, peacock, and spiced wine in the grand refectory. They were entertained with tournaments in the outer bailey, with hunts in the marshes around Lake Druzno, with concerts of German minnesingers brought up from the Rhineland for the season. The order kept a master of ceremonies called the Marshal der Gäste, the Marshal of Guests, whose only job was to keep the visiting lords happy. Then, when the temperature finally dropped and the marshes froze hard enough to take cavalry, the Grand Master rode out at their head. The campaigns were not battles. They were raids dressed as crusades. The column would cross the Niemen River and ride into Samogitia or the upper Niemen Valley. They would burn villages. They would slaughter peasants in their fields. They would take captives, mostly women and children, to be sold or settled as serfs in Prussian villages. They would torch grain stores and butcher livestock. Wigand of Marburg's Chronicle lists the names of dozens of these expeditions with the same flat language. Burned, killed, returned with prisoners. The campaign of January AD 1377 alone, led by Grand Master Winrich von Kniprodi, burned through 14 villages in 9 days. Real fighting was rare. The Lithuanians were tribal levies who scattered into the forest at the sight of heavy cavalry. The pagan slaying experience was usually the butchering of farmers who could not get to the trees fast enough. After 2 or 3 weeks of this, the column returned to Marienburg. The guests were celebrated as heroes of Christendom. Their names were inscribed on the Errentisch, the Table of Honor, a wooden tablet kept in the Grand Master's hall and read aloud at feasts. 12 names per campaign, chosen by the Marshal of Guests for valor real or invented. They made a generous contribution to the order's treasury on their way out. They sailed home through Danzig with relics, furs, and dinner table stories that would last them 30 years. It was a perfect business. Money came in. Political connections grew. A constant flow of trained warriors arrived to fight under the order's banner for free. Lithuanian territory was chipped away one frozen field at a time. The War for Christ had become a product line, packaged and sold to noble customers across the continent. The entire model rested on one assumption: Lithuania had to stay pagan. Without paganism, the product had nothing to sell. In AD 1386, that assumption died in a cathedral in Krakow. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jagiełło, was a politician on a level the order had never seen. He was the son of Algirdas and a Tver princess, raised in the wooden capital of Vilnius, where his father had kept the sacred fire of Perkunas, burning in front of the prince's hall. He looked at his strategic situation. To his west, the Teutonic state pressed harder every year. To his east, the Grand Duchy of Moscow was rising under Dmitry Donskoy. To his south, the Kingdom of Poland had just lost its king and was searching for a new one. The Polish nobility had crowned the 11-year-old Hungarian princess Jadwiga as their queen in October AD 1384, and they needed a husband for her who could anchor the kingdom against the order. Jagiełło made the offer in August AD 1385 in the Polish town of Kraków. He would marry Jadwiga. He would convert to Catholicism. He would baptize the entire Lithuanian population. He would return all Polish prisoners held in Lithuania. He would unite his treasury with the Polish crown. In exchange, he would wear the Polish crown alongside her, and the two states would be joined under one family. On February 15, AD 1386, in Wawel Cathedral, he was baptized as Władysław. The Archbishop of Gniezno, Bodzanta, poured the water. 3 days later, he married Jadwiga, who was 12 years old and reportedly wept at the altar. The marriage was consummated under the supervision of court witnesses, a humiliating Polish custom designed to confirm legitimacy. Jadwiga was canonized as a saint 6 centuries later. Jogaila reigned as Władysław II Jagiełło for 48 years. The pagan threat was gone in less than a week. Overnight, the order's product had no market. Their reaction told the truth about everything they had ever claimed. They did not celebrate the conversion. They did not lay down their swords and go home. They did not even pretend to consider it a victory for Christ. They went on the attack. Their diplomats fanned out across Europe. The conversion was a fraud, they wrote. Jogaila was lying. The Lithuanians were still worshipping perkunas in the forests, still keeping the sacred fires burning, still sacrificing animals at oak trees. They produced false witnesses. They paid for sermons in German cathedrals. They lobbied the Curia at Avignon under Pope Urban VI. They lobbied the courts at Prague and Buda. They argued that the Holy War had to continue because the conversion was a political trick. The mask had come off completely. For 150 years they had claimed the war was about souls. Now, faced with souls that had already been saved, they kept fighting for the land underneath those souls. The strategic prize was a strip of territory called Samogitia, the lowland country between the lower Niemen and the Baltic. It mattered because it physically separated the Teutonic state in Prussia from the order's other arm, the Livonian branch up the coast in modern Latvia and Estonia. Take Samogitia, and the order would hold an unbroken sovereign coastline from Pomerania to the Gulf of Finland. The cross was a cover. The real target was a contiguous map. But the order had spent a century fighting scattered tribes, and the institutional brain could not adjust to what it now faced. The new Polish-Lithuanian Union was a state the size of France and Germany combined. It stretched from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Its population dwarfed the order's, around 8 million against a Prussian population of perhaps 500,000. Its cavalry tradition, especially among the Lithuanian boyars, was older than the order itself. Its king, Władysław II Jagiełło, had been raised in a warrior culture that valued patience the way the Teutons valued bricks. His cousin Vytautas, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, had once been a hostage in Marienburg himself, had learned every weakness of the order from inside its walls, and had escaped in AD 1382 disguised as a serving woman. The knights in Marienburg saw none of this. They had never lost. Generations of easy winters in the Lithuanian forests had taught them that they were the apex predator of the Baltic. They spoke of Władysław in the chancery letters as a baptized barbarian. They raided his borders. They sheltered his enemies. They mocked him publicly in pamphlets distributed at the Council of Constance years later. They thought his patience was weakness. It was the most expensive misreading in the order's history. While they laughed in Marienburg, Władysław and Vytautas were quietly building one of the largest armies medieval Europe would ever assemble. The two cousins met in secret at Brest-Litovsk in December AD 1409 and spent 8 days planning the campaign hour by hour. They had pontoon bridges built in advance, hidden upriver, ready to be floated down to the Vistula at the right moment. They had Tatar light cavalry summoned from the Crimean steppe. They had Czech veterans hired in Prague, including a one-eyed captain who would later become the most feared soldier of his century. The break came in AD 1409. A Samogitian uprising flared up against Teutonic rule, and Poland-Lithuania supported it openly. The Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, declared war on the Commonwealth in August. Ulrich was the order's institutional culture poured into a single man. He had been elected Grand Master in June AD 1407, succeeding his older brother Conrad, who had died of a stroke in the chapel of St. Anne. Aggressive, proud, conventional. He had grown up on Ryzen campaigns where Teutonic cavalry broke pagan villagers like dry sticks. He believed in the heavy charge the way other men believed in Scripture. He believed his armored knights, blessed by the order's chaplains and riding under the Black Cross, could not be defeated by Slavs and Lithuanians no matter how many they were. He spent the winter of 1409 to 1410 pulling together every resource the order had. Knights from Prussia and Livonia, mercenary infantry from Bohemia and Silesia, crossbowmen from Genoa, paid in advance at 3 groschen per day, cannon, a new weapon the order had embraced early, including bombards cast in foundries at Marienburg itself, and the usual flock of foreign guests, German lords and Hungarian counts, who had answered the invitation to one more glorious pagan hunt, even though the pagans no longer technically existed. King Sigismund of Hungary promised support, but sent only token cavalry. King Wenceslas of Bohemia accepted a bribe of 60,000 florins to arbitrate in the order's favor, and then changed his mind. In late June of AD 1410, Ulrich marched his army east out of Marienburg toward the Polish border. The column stretched for miles. Banners of 50 different lordships flapped above the dust. Priests rode in carts singing the psalm Exurgat Deus. On the morning of July 15th, AD 1410, the two armies stood on a stretch of farmland between 3 villages, Tannenberg to the north, Grunwald to the south, Ludwigsdorf between them, wheat fields not yet harvested, a few low ridges, scattered woodland on the flanks, a stream called the Marosa cutting through the middle, a small lake on the Polish right where the Tatars watered their horses at dawn. The Teutonic army numbered around 27,000. It was the most heavily armored fighting force in Europe. Plate harnesses polished to a glare, long lances of ash wood, war horses bred in order studs in Pomerania, 18 hands tall. They formed up on a slight rise. The white mantles with black crosses, ranks of them, ran like a wall of chalk across the field. The order's great banner, with its enormous black cross on a white field, snapped above the center of the line. Beside it flew 50 subordinate banners, one for each commandery and allied lord, recorded later in the Banderia Prutenorum, an illustrated catalogue commissioned by King Władysław after the battle. Across the valley, the Polish-Lithuanian army was larger, probably 39,000 strong, and looked nothing like the order. Polish heavy cavalry under Marshal Zbigniew of Brzezy on the left, Lithuanian light horse under Grand Duke Vytautas on the right, Ruthenian regiments from Smolensk in the center, 3 banners of them, who would hold their ground later in the day when everyone else around them broke. A unit of 300 Tatar horsemen from the steppes, sent by Khan Jalal al-Din, son of Toktamish, repaying a debt of hospitality Vytautas had once shown him in exile. Czech mercenaries, including a young captain named Jan Žižka, blind in one eye from a childhood accident, who would survive this day and go on to invent modern field artillery a decade later in the Hussite Wars. Moldavian boyars under Voivode Alexander the Good. Even a small group of Serbian volunteers, refugees from the wars further south. The Polish king sat behind his lines in a tent on a small hill called the King's Hill, hearing 2 masses one after the other. The chronicler Jan Długosz, writing 50 years later from the testimony of veterans, reports the king refused to mount his horse until the second mass was finished. Some of his commanders thought he was stalling out of fear. He was not. He was waiting for the sun to climb high enough to blind the Teutonic line, which faced east. He was also waiting because Vytautas had advised him that the heat would do the work of an hour of fighting before the first arrow flew. The hours dragged on. The temperature rose. The knights inside their plate began to suffer. Steel armor in July sun turns into a slow oven. Men fainted in the saddle. Water ran out. Pages were sent back and forth with leather flasks. One Teutonic commander, Friedrich von Wallenrode of the order's left wing, removed his helmet for relief and was sunburned across the face by mid-morning. Ulrich von Jungingen sat on his horse and watched the enemy refuse to move. He read their stillness as fear. His advisors begged him to wait. The Grand Commander Kuno von Liechtenstein urged caution. The Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenrode wanted to send scouts around the Polish flank. Ulrich refused. The whole institutional pride of the order had walked into the field with him, and that pride needed a fight before noon. He decided to insult the Polish king into attacking. He called for two of his heralds. One wore the colors of the Holy Roman Empire, the other those of the Duchy of Stettin, both chosen to lend imperial weight to the insult. He handed each of them a naked sword, unsheathed, the blades catching the sun. The swords were plain arming swords, made in the order's own forges at Elbing. They rode across the open ground under a flag of truce, their horses walking through wheat that came up to the stirrups. They reached the Polish royal tent. They delivered the message in Latin, then again in German. The Grand Master sends these swords to King Władysław and Grand Duke Vytautas. He sends them so that you may find your courage and come down out of the woods where you have been hiding like rabbits. Władysław stood up. He was 58 years old. He had been listening to the Mass barefoot on a wool cloak. He took both swords, one in each hand. He said in Polish, loud enough for the witnesses to remember the line, "I accept these swords. I will use them. God will be the judge." The chronicler Jan Długosz, working from eyewitness accounts a generation later, wrote that the king's hands did not shake. The two swords would later become national relics of Poland, carried in royal coronations until they were lost in the chaos of the 18th century partitions. The history you are hearing now is built from chronicles and archives. To stand inside this story, you need the primary source on your shelf. The book that anchored this episode is one of the great works of dark medieval research, a deep look into the Order's machinery of conquest and the day that broke it. It is available right now on this video. Click the View Products button on your screen. This volume is essential if you want the full picture behind everything you have heard tonight, and it deserves a place in your collection. While you are there, I have curated other themed pieces in the shop. I will not spoil what is waiting, but if you look through what is on the shelf, you will find darker memorabilia from this world, ready to complete your journey into the Teutonic story. Open the shop now. Explore the relics while the story continues. The king gave the signal. Trumpets sounded across the Polish line, the long curved horns of the Lithuanian regiments answering from the right. The Lithuanian horse on the right surged forward first, 3,000 light cavalry pouring downhill toward the Teutonic left flank, the war cry of Vilnius rising over the wheat. The Order's heavy cavalry braced their lances. The Order's bombards fired their opening volley. 2 shots, both falling short into a low marsh and exploding in mud and steam. The first crash of steel on steel echoed across the valley. The battle that would decide the future of northeastern Europe had begun. But what Ulrich von Jungingen did not yet understand, as he watched the Lithuanians smash into his left wing under Friedrich von Wallenrode, was that he had not provoked his enemy into a reckless attack. He had stepped into a trap that his enemy had been preparing for him for over a year, a trap older than the order itself, drawn from the Mongol playbook Vytautas had studied during his exile years on the Black Sea coast, a trap that would, by sundown, leave the largest fighting force the Teutonic state had ever fielded lying dead in the Rye. And the man who built that trap was already smiling inside his tent, watching the dust rise on his right wing exactly as he had planned, counting the minutes before the false retreat would begin. The Lithuanian charge came in like a storm front. 3,000 light riders in fur caps and lamellar armor, their nobles in mail shirts, their Tatar allies firing composite bows from the saddle at full gallop. Their war cries were in 3 languages at once: Lithuanian on the right wing, Ruthenian in the center. The high-pitched Tatar yell from the steppe contingent on the outermost flank. They hit the Teutonic left under Friedrich von Wallenrode with a sound that one survivor, a Silesian crossbowman named Heinrich Pfaffenberg, later described in a letter to his brother as a forest of axes falling at once. The knights held. The first rank of Wallenrode's banners lowered their lances and broke the leading riders. The second rank closed the gaps. Plate armor turned aside arrows that would have killed a man in chainmail. Polish chronicles record that one knight, Marquard von Salzbach, fought with 7 Tatar arrows lodged in his breastplate and kept his saddle. The Tatars wheeled, fired again, peeled back. The Lithuanian boyars came in for a second charge, sabers and short axes against couched lances. Horses screamed. Men fell into the wheat and were trampled. The wheat itself was waist-high and almost ripe, and where the cavalry crossed it, the stalks were ground into a paste of straw and blood by the second hour. The melee on the flank lasted nearly an hour. Ulrich von Jungingen watched from his command knoll behind the center, one gauntleted hand resting on the pommel of his saddle, the other holding the reins of his white destrier, a horse he had named Friedland after a town he had taken on Ryzen in AD 1402. The chronicler Długosz says he turned to his confessor, a brother named Johann von Redern, and remarked that God had clearly chosen his side already. The confessor crossed himself and said nothing. Then the Lithuanian line bent. Then it broke. Then it ran. The entire right wing of the Allied army turned and bolted east into the broken country beyond the field. Banners trailing in the dust. Horses lashed into a flat-out gallop. Vytautas himself riding at the head of the retreat, shouting orders nobody on the orders side could hear, because the orders were in Lithuanian, and the orders men did not speak it. To the Teutonic knights, this was every winter they had ever spent in Lithuania compressed into one moment. The barbarians breaking. The pagans showing what they really were. The smell of victory in the hot July air. Von Wallenrode roared the pursuit order. He had been a knight of the order for 31 years. He had ridden on 12 Rysen. He had never once seen heavy cavalry beaten on open ground. The knights of his wing put spurs to their war horses and went after the fleeing Lithuanians. The senior commanders behind Ulrich begged him to call them back. Kuno von Liechtenstein, the Grand Commander, rode up and shouted into the Grand Master's helmet that this was the old steppe trick, the feigned flight, that the Mongols had used it to destroy the Hungarians at Mohi in AD 1241 and the Poles at Liegnitz in the same year. Liechtenstein had read Vincent of Beauvais. He knew the histories. Ulrich brushed him off. He believed the Lithuanians were not Mongols. He believed his own men were not Hungarians. He gave the order for a general advance. This was the decision that lost the war. The bulk of the order's cavalry abandoned its strong defensive ridge and surged forward across the Marosa stream in pursuit. 18,000 armored men in motion, the ground shaking under them, the dust climbing 50 feet into the air. The water of the Marosa, which had run clear at dawn, was the color of milk and clay by mid-morning where the horses crossed. They galloped past the Polish lines on their right, which stood completely still under Marshal Zbigniew of Brzezy, not moving a single horse. Some Teutonic knights waved their lances mockingly at the Polish line as they thundered past. They plunged into the wet ground beyond the field. The war horses began to flounder. Bred for one terrible charge on firm ground, the Pomeranian destriers sank fetlock deep in the marsh that fringed Lake Lubian. The marsh that morning had been steaming faintly in the heat, and the smell of stagnant water and crushed reeds now mixed with the sweat of the horses and the iron smell of opened veins. Men shouted at each other through their visors. The neat ranks dissolved into a scattered crowd of pursuers, stretched across half a mile of broken country. From the tree line on the right, the trap closed. Vytautas had spent the months before the campaign reading Vytautas in a Latin manuscript copied for him in Krakow, and listening to old Mongol veterans who had served under Toktamish at the Vorskla River in AD 1399, where Vytautas himself had been beaten. He had learned that defeat. He had drilled the Lithuanian regiments for one specific maneuver in the winter camps along the Niemen. Run for 20 minutes. Wheel on a horn signal. Reform. Countercharge. The retreating Lithuanians now did exactly that. The horns cut through the dust. They were the long, curved horns made from aurochs cattle still found in the deep Polish forests. The light cavalry pivoted as one and came back. At the same moment, fresh Polish reserves, who had been held in dead ground behind a low rise, came out of the trees on the Teutonic flank. Smolensk Ruthenians, under Prince Yuri Lugvenovich of Mstislav, 3 banners of them, who had been ordered to die in place if necessary, and refused to break even when one of their 3 banners was cut down. Czech mercenaries under Jan Žižka, the one-eyed captain who would learn the trick of using farm wagons as mobile forts on this exact day. A second wave of Tatars, firing into the bogged-down knights from 40 paces. The arrows so close they punched through plate at the joints. The order's cavalry could not maneuver. The horses were stuck. The men were exhausted, dehydrated, half-cooked inside their plate. Some chronicles record that knights climbed off their horses on their own to fight on foot, only to sink to their knees in the mud and be killed where they stood. Polish foot soldiers with long axes called bardisi stepped between the floundering horses and worked from the legs upward. They hamstrung the animals. When the knights fell, they pried open visors with daggers and finished them on the ground. The black cross on white made every target visible at 50 yards. A Polish chronicler called it the harvest in the rye. Back on the main ridge, the Polish heavy cavalry finally moved. Zbigniew of Brzezy waited until Vytautas had turned the trap. Then he raised the great standard of the Kingdom of Poland, the white eagle on red, embroidered by the nuns of the convent of Stary Sącz over the course of 8 months. The Polish lances came down in a single rolling motion across the whole line. 6,000 heavy horsemen rolled forward at a trot, then a canter, then full gallop, and slammed into what was left of the Teutonic center. The shock was so heavy that 2 of the order's bombards, abandoned by their gunners, were rolled over and crushed into the dirt. The order's reserve under the Grand Marshal stood and fought. Banner after banner went down. The standard-bearer of the Kulm contingent, a knight named Nikolaus von Rennes, lowered his banner deliberately at some point in the chaos, an act that would later be tried as treason and end with his beheading in Graudenz in AD 1411. The banner of St. George, carried by foreign volunteers, fell. The banner of Pomerania fell. The banner of Elbing fell. The banner of the city of Danzig, with its red cross on white, fell. The banner of Christburg, with its grey castle on red, fell. The chronicler Długosz lists 51 captured banners by name in his Banderia Prutanorum, all later hung in the Wawel Cathedral as trophies, where most of them rotted on the walls over the next 3 centuries before being copied into a colored manuscript that survives today. Ulrich von Jungingen saw the field collapsing around him. He gathered 16 brother knights from his household guard, men whose names are recorded in the order's death rolls: Werner von Tettingen, Konrad Liechtenstein, Heinrich von Plauen the Younger, a cousin of the man at Schwetz. They made a personal charge into the center of the Polish line, aiming for the king's tent on the hill. The Polish bodyguard, led by the knight Zawisza Czarny, the black-armored champion of the kingdom, who had once defeated all comers at a tournament in Buda, met him head-on. Zawisza himself was unhorsed twice in the melee, and remounted both times. 2 accounts of the Grand Master's death survive. Długosz says a Polish knight named Mszczurz of Skrzyno struck him with a lance through the side of his throat, where the bever met the breastplate. A second tradition recorded in the Chronica Conflictus, written within months of the battle by a churchman close to the king, says a Lithuanian foot soldier, a peasant levy from the village of Derwiany, ran up under the press of horses and drove a horseman's spear into the small gap behind the Grand Master's right knee, severing the femoral artery. Either way, Ulrich von Jungingen bled out in less than a minute, slumped forward in the saddle, then pulled to the ground by men who did not yet know who he was. They stripped his gauntlets first, then his helmet. Then they recognized the face. The myth of Teutonic invincibility drowned in the marsh with him. By sunset, the field belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian army. 203 brother knights of the order lay dead, almost the entire senior leadership. Grand Master, Grand Commander, Grand Marshal, Grand Treasurer, Grand Hospitaller, the Vogt of Samogitia, the Komtur of Brandenburg, the Komtur of Tuchel, a man named Heinrich von Schwelborn, whose arrogance was so famous that the chroniclers say a herald had to walk in front of him at all times carrying his banner. 8,000 soldiers killed, 14,000 taken prisoner. The order had marched out of Marienburg with the largest army it had ever fielded and had lost every level of command in a single afternoon. Władysław II. Jagiełło walked the field at dusk with a priest at his elbow. He carried a wooden crucifix that had been blessed at his baptism in AD 1386. Długosz records him weeping at the sight of the bodies, kneeling once in the wheat to pray over a dying knight he did not know. He ordered the body of Ulrich von Jungingen washed in wine, wrapped in purple cloth, and sent under guard to Marienburg with an honor escort of 6 Polish nobles. Even his enemy got the funeral of a sovereign. The bodies of the senior Teutonic commanders were laid out in the village church of Tannenberg overnight, while local Polish priests sang the office for the dead in Latin and the candles burned down to stubs. The news of the disaster spread like fire through dry grass. Couriers reached the commanderies of Prussia within days. In Königsberg, the cathedral bell tolled for an hour without stopping. In Danzig, the merchants began moving their gold to Lübeck the same week, packed in oak crates labeled as salt fish. In every smaller castle, the question was the same: how long before the Polish army arrives at our gate? The road to Marienburg was open. The capital was undefended. Most of the local commanders panicked and surrendered their castles without a fight. Elbing capitulated within a week. Christburg surrendered next. Schwetz, Meaux, Dirschau all opened their gates. The Polish king began a slow advance north, expecting the white flag before he reached the river. He did not get it. The man who saved the order was not a knight from a famous family. He was a castle administrator named Heinrich von Plauen, commander of the small fortress at Schwetz on the Vistula. He had not been at Grunwald. He had been left behind to guard the southwestern frontier with a garrison of 3,000 men, most of them Pomeranian mercenaries paid by the month. He was 40 years old, the son of a minor Vogtland family from the Saxon hills, a man whose career had been spent on grain accounts, toll receipts, and bridge repairs over the lower Vistula. When the news reached Schwetz on July the 16th, carried by a single survivor named Casimir Welsing, who had ridden 2 horses to death getting there, von Plauen did not call a council. He did not write to the surviving commanders. He made the decision alone within an hour. He pulled every man out of Schwetz, told the local German farmers to fall back behind the walls, and force-marched north along the river. He arrived at Marienburg on July 18th, 3 days before the Polish vanguard appeared on the horizon. He found the city in panic. Most of the surviving commanders were dead or captured. The treasurer, Thomas von Merheim, had locked himself in the chancery and was burning papers. The town outside the castle was packed with refugees from the burned villages of central Prussia. The chronicler Posilje records that the streets were so crowded a horse could not be ridden through them. Von Plauen seized command on his own authority. There was no one to challenge him. He stood on the steps of the middle castle and read out an oath to the assembled remnants of the garrison. He gave one order before sunset on his first day, and it told everyone who he was. Burn the town. The entire city of Marienburg. The wharves on the Nogat. The warehouses stacked with rye and wheat being held for export to Bruges. The merchants' houses with their painted gables. The market hall where the amber traders met every Wednesday. The brewery on the river. The Carmelite church just outside the south wall. The German settlers who had lived there for 3 generations were given 6 hours to take what they could carry and move inside the castle walls. Mothers carried iron pots strapped to their backs. Old men dragged chairs through the gate. Then his men put torches to everything. The smoke was visible from 40 miles away. The Polish vanguard, riding north, watched the horizon turn black for an entire afternoon. They knew before they arrived that the easy surrender they had expected was not coming. It was the act of a man who understood the order as a balance sheet. The town was an asset. The castle was the company. Assets could be liquidated to save the company. He had cleared the field of fire around his walls. He had denied the enemy every barn, every cellar, every roof for a mile in every direction. He had also broken the loyalty of the very Prussian burghers who had paid the order's taxes for 200 years. That bill would come due later. For now, it bought him a siege he could win. The Polish-Lithuanian army arrived on July 26th and surrounded the castle. The siege of Marienburg ran for 8 weeks. Von Plauen managed it like an accountant. He rationed flour by the ounce, weighed out each morning on a brass scale in the granary of the Outer Bailey. He rotated guards in 4-hour shifts and made the rotation himself in a leather notebook. He counted crossbow bolts. He had the brothers sing matins on the walls before dawn each day to remind the besiegers that the castle was still functioning, that the bells were still ringing, that the chapel had not gone silent. He sent runners out through a postern gate at night with letters to the Livonian branch of the order, to the King of Hungary, to the cities of the Hanseatic League, begging for relief. One of those runners, a sergeant named Dietrich von Logendorf, made it through to Livonia and returned 40 days later with a relief column of 500 knights. Inside the Polish camp, dysentery was killing more men than the walls. The army had marched without proper supply trains. The summer heat fermented the food. Latrine trenches dug too close to the wells contaminated the water within a week. The Lithuanian and Tatar contingents, who served at their own pleasure, began to drift home for the harvest. By early September, Vytautas himself withdrew, riding east with his personal banner because his men needed to be in the fields by Michaelmas. Władysław held on through the first 3 weeks of September, then accepted the inevitable. On September 19th, AD 1410, the Polish army broke camp and marched south. Von Plauen watched them go from the highest tower of the high castle, the one called the Tower of the Latrines because the Dansker shaft dropped straight down from its base into the river. Heinrich von Plauen had saved the Teutonic state. His reward came 3 years later. The surviving brother knights, the aristocrats who had watched a Vogtland castle clerk do what they could not, hated him. They could not endure being commanded by a man they considered their social inferior. They saw him not as a savior, but as a daily reminder of the field at Grunwald, where their friends and brothers had died. They began to undermine him from the moment he was elected Grand Master on November 9th, AD 1410. They whispered against him in the chapter house. They wrote to allies in Germany suggesting he was insane. They blocked his appointments to commanderies. They sabotaged his treaty negotiations with Poland. When von Plauen tried to renew the war against Poland in AD 1413, planning a winter campaign to recover lost territory, the Grand Marshal Michael Kuchmeister refused to march. He claimed the order could not afford another war. He led a coup inside the order's general chapter on October 7th, AD 1413, in the same chapter house where von Plauen had taken his oath. Von Plauen was arrested in his own chambers the next morning while he was eating breakfast. He was deposed. He was thrown into a cell in the castle of Engelsburg, then later moved to Lochstedt on the Baltic coast, where the sea fog rolled in every morning and salt corroded the iron bars of his window. He spent nearly the rest of his life in confinement. He died in AD 1429, broken, forgotten by the order he had rescued. The brothers who buried him did not enter his name on the order's commemoration roll. That single act of pettiness sealed everything that came after. The military spine had been broken at Grunwald. The institutional soul was broken with the betrayal of von Plauen. What followed was 100 years of slow rot. The Prussian cities had been watching. Danzig, Thorn, Elbing, Königsberg. They had grown into wealthy Hanseatic ports under the order's protection. Their warehouses stretched a quarter-mile along the waterfronts. Their merchant houses had stained glass windows imported from Cologne. They had also grown to hate the taxes, the trade monopolies, the constant requisitions of grain and ships for wars they had not asked for. They watched as the order's debts mounted and the new mercenary garrisons inside their cities demanded room and board for free. They saw the order weakened. They calculated. In February AD 1454, the major cities formed the Prussian Confederation in the town of Thorn, in the same town hall where Copernicus would one day be baptized. They marched on the order's local fortresses. 56 castles fell to the citizens within 6 weeks, mostly without a fight. Some of them were torn down brick by the very German settlers whose great-grandfathers had built them. They asked King Casimir IV of Poland to take them as his subjects. Casimir accepted on March 6, AD 1454. The 13 Years' War began. It was a war of attrition the order could not win. The order had no money. It hired mercenaries with promissory notes drawn on revenues that had stopped flowing. The mercenary captains began to talk to the other side. In AD 1457, the Czech mercenaries holding Marienburg itself, led by a captain named Ulrich Czervenka, sold the castle to the King of Poland for 190,000 Hungarian florins, because the Grand Master had failed to pay their wages for 3 years. The greatest brick fortress on earth changed hands not in battle, but for cash, handed over at a dawn ceremony at the main gate, the keys passed in a velvet bag. The Grand Master, Ludwig von Erlichshausen, slipped out a side gate at night in a borrowed cart, with a single chest of relics and the order's seal. He rode east to Königsberg in disguise. The war dragged on until October AD 1466. The second Peace of Thorn, signed in the Artushof of the city on October 19th, ended it. The order lost West Prussia entirely. It lost Marienburg, Elbing, Danzig, the lower Vistula. It kept only the eastern half of its old state with a new capital at Königsberg, and the Grand Master had to kneel before the King of Poland and swear fealty as a vassal. The treaty was signed by Grand Master Ludwig at a table draped in red velvet, his hand shaking so badly the Polish chancellor had to steady the inkwell. The sovereign state Hermann von Salza had conjured out of paper in Rimini in AD 1226 was now a province of its oldest enemy. 240 years. That was the lifespan of independent Teutonic Prussia. The final act came not on a battlefield, but in a market square. In AD 1511, the order elected a new Grand Master named Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach. He was 21 years old, a younger son of the Hohenzollern house, well-educated, fluent in Latin, fluent in Italian, ambitious without illusions. His mother was the daughter of King Casimir IV of Poland, which made him a nephew of the very kings whose grandfather had broken the order. The Brotherhood had elected him precisely because of that bloodline, hoping he could negotiate better terms with Krakow. He had different plans. He looked at his inheritance and saw a corpse propped up in a chair. The treasury was empty. The Brotherhood numbered fewer than 200 men, most of them old, many of them illiterate. The Polish king collected oaths from him like rent. The old crusading model was dead. In Germany, something new was being born. Martin Luther had nailed his theses to the church door at Wittenberg in October AD 1517. The Reformation was sweeping through the German lands. Catholic monasteries were being dissolved and their lands handed to local princes. The old religious orders were collapsing across Saxony, Hesse, Brandenburg. Bishops were marrying their housekeepers in public. Albert traveled to Wittenberg in late November AD 1523. He arrived in plain clothes, without the white mantle. He stayed in the house of the printer Hans Luft. He met Luther on 3 consecutive evenings in Luther's study, a small room with a tile stove and shelves of unbound books. He met Philip Melanchthon the following morning over breakfast. He did not go for prayer. He went for advice. Luther gave it without hesitation. Throw off the vows. Get married. Take the land for yourself. Convert the state. Become a hereditary prince. The Catholic structure was finished. Move first or lose everything. Melanchthon wrote out a step-by-step plan in Latin and gave it to Albert before he left. Albert went home and made his move. On April 10th, AD 1525, in the central market square of Krakow, in front of the Cathedral of St. Mary and the cloth hall of the Sukiennes, Albert of Brandenburg knelt on a red carpet before King Sigismund I of Poland. The carpet had been laid down that morning by servants of the Polish chancellor. He was not wearing the white mantle with the black cross. He had set it aside in his lodgings at dawn, folded by his valet into a wooden chest. He was dressed as a secular German prince in a fur-lined cloak of black sable, with a sword that had belonged to his grandfather. He placed his hands between the king's hands. He swore fealty as a Lutheran duke in Latin, then again in German for the watching crowd. He stood up as the first Duke of Prussia. The monastic state of the Teutonic Order was dissolved by the signature of its own Grand Master. The lands became his personal hereditary property, to be passed to his sons. The remaining brothers were given a choice: convert to Lutheranism and keep their estates as Albert's vassals, or leave. Most stayed. Out of the 55 who refused, most retired to small commanderies in southern Germany. The Catholic remnant of the order continued in fragments scattered across Germany and Austria, eventually shrinking to a small charitable society in Vienna that still exists today, running hospitals and elderly care homes in the Austrian Alps. The chronicler Lucas David, writing a generation later, called it the Prussian homage. The Polish painter Jan Matejko would put the scene on a canvas 3 centuries afterward, finished in AD 1882, and it now hangs in the National Museum in Warsaw, 15 feet wide, showing Albert in his fur cloak and the kneeling end of 299 years of warrior monks. Matejko painted himself into the crowd, holding a sword. The Templars had chosen martyrdom and got a legend. The Teutonic Knights chose conversion and got something stranger. They got the future. Albert's Duchy of Prussia did not die. It grew. He ruled it for 33 years. He founded the University of Königsberg in AD 1544. He invited Lutheran scholars and Reformed printers from across Germany. In AD 1618, the duchy merged through inheritance with the Margraviate of Brandenburg under the Hohenzollern family. In AD 1701, Albert's descendant Frederick crowned himself king in Prussia at Königsberg, in a ceremony where he placed the crown on his own head because no superior authority was recognized. The Kingdom of Prussia would grow through the 18th century into the most disciplined military state in Europe. Frederick the Great would humiliate Austria at Rossbach in AD 1757 and France with armies drilled on the Teutonic model. In AD 1871, the King of Prussia would be proclaimed Emperor of a unified Germany in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, his coronation marshal carrying a sword in the old Hohenzollern style. The black cross on white that the knights had carried into the Prussian forests in AD 1231 would be painted on the wings of German aircraft in 2 world wars. The men who burned Henrik Monty over a low fire in AD 1273 did not die out. They incorporated. They rebranded. They survived every century that followed by becoming something new each time the old form failed. Hermann von Salza built a state out of legal paperwork. Heinrich von Plauen saved it by burning his own city. Albert of Brandenburg dissolved it to preserve its land. 3 men, 1 unbroken instinct. Survival as the only virtue. That is why the Templars get the novels and the films, and the Teutonic Knights get the footnotes. The Templars made a beautiful corpse. The Teutonic Knights made a German empire. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the cold market square in Krakow, all the way through the wheat field at Grunwald, and the burning streets of Marienburg. If this story has changed how you see the men in white cloaks, leave a comment below telling us which part hit hardest. Subscribe so the next descent into the dark gears of history does not pass you by. Share this video with someone who needs to see how power actually moves through the centuries. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. The next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now. The descent continues.